November 25th, 1120. The English Channel, 1 mile north of the port of Barfleur on the Normandy coast. It is a moonless night. The water is 4 degrees. The ship that just set sail is called the Blanche Neuf, the White Ship, the fastest in Europe, newly outfitted, captained by a man named Thomas Fitzstephen, who that same afternoon had asked the King of England for the honor of carrying him aboard his vessel. King Henry I declined the offer, but he agreed to what would be the worst decision of his life. He allowed the man to carry his only legitimate son aboard that same ship. William Adelin, 17 years old, sole heir to the throne of England. The chronicler Henry of Huntingdon describes the last image of the heir that night. Dressed in silks embroidered with gold, surrounded by a multitude of attendants and guards, shining in an almost celestial glory. 300 people went aboard with him. Half the Anglo-Norman nobility, his half-siblings, knights, chaplains. They were drunk. When the white ship struck the Quay-Buff rock 1 mile out of port, the screams of the passengers faded within minutes. The bodies sank before the wreckage did. At dawn, the fishermen of Barfleur found only one thing floating on the water: a broken mast. And clinging to the mast, a man, alive. The sole survivor was a butcher from Rouen who had come aboard the night before to collect debts from the nobles. He was wearing sheepskin. Wool floated. Silk did not. The chronicler William of Malmesbury summed up the disaster years later in a single line: "No ship that ever sailed brought such misery to England." They sent a boy to deliver the news to King Henry. No adult was willing to confirm to the king that his only heir was dead. The king collapsed to the floor, and according to the chroniclers, he never smiled again. 15 years later, on that same night of November 25th, the night royal silk sank, the worst civil war in medieval England was unleashed. And 900 years later, an American writer named George R.R. Martin turned it into House of the Dragon. Martin has said it in his own words in different interviews again and again. "I take real history, I file off the details that give it away, I turn up the intensity, and I take it to the max. No matter how much I invent, there are things in history just as bad or worse." In 2026, HBO premieres the 3rd season of House of the Dragon. The Targaryen civil war between Queen Rhaenyra and her half-brother Aegon II over the Iron Throne. Today, you are going to understand that this war was not invention. It was rewriting. What you saw on the show, the daughter named heir, the lords who swear loyalty and betray, the half-brother who sits first on the stolen throne, years of unchecked civil war has already happened in England between 1120 and 1154, only there were no dragons. And when you understand that, you will also understand why an anonymous 12th century chronicler, writing from a monastery in Peterborough, summed up those 15 years in 5 words that any medieval historian recognizes instantly: Christ and his saints slept. 15 years in which, according to the chronicler, God had abandoned England. To understand the Anarchy, the 15-year civil war that split 12th century England in two, you have to understand a woman. And to understand that woman, you have to understand that her father named her heir because he had no other option. When William Adelin drowned in the Channel, Henry I was left without a legitimate male heir. He remarried in 1121. He never had another son, but he had a daughter. Her name was Matilda, the woman who inspired Rhaenyra Targaryen. In 1120, when her brother died, Matilda was not in England. She was in Germany. At 12, she had been married off to Henry V, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. At 23, she was widowed. She returned to England as Empress, a title she kept until her death, even though it no longer belonged to her. Her father named her heir of England and Normandy. But Matilda was not the only woman marked by that court. The second wife Henry I had taken to produce a new heir was called Adeliza of Louvain, one of the two women who inspired Alicent Hightower. She was 18 when she married a 53-year-old king, Matilda's stepmother, yet of the same generation. And here comes the detail Martin portrays almost line for line in House of the Dragon, and that most viewers assume is fiction: the forced oaths. Henry I knew his lords would never accept a queen, so he gathered them in 3 separate ceremonies. One in 1127, another in 1131, and a third ceremony shortly before the king's death, in which the great barons of England solemnly swore before God and before the king that when Henry died, they would obey Matilda as their sovereign. In House of the Dragon, King Viserys takes those oaths from his lords before Rhaenyra in a hall with dragons carved in stone. In real England, Henry I took them at Westminster before the altar. But in both cases, the same thing happened. The oaths were worth nothing. When Henry I died in December 1135 in Normandy, the chroniclers note an almost comical detail, considering the horror that would follow. He choked on a dish of lampreys, fish, and with that, the male line of the Norman dynasty ended. Matilda, at that moment, was in Anjou, south of Normandy, too far away to react in time. Her cousin Stephen of Blois, grandson of William the Conqueror, nephew of Henry I, had nearly died on the White Ship 15 years before and had stepped off at the last moment. When he learned Henry was dead, he did not wait. Stephen was in Boulogne on the French coast. He rowed to the port, crossed the English Channel in the dead of winter, an enormous risk in a sea that killed entire ships, as it had killed the White Ship 15 years before, landed on the English coast, and entered London before Matilda even knew her father was dead. 3 weeks later, on December 22nd, 1135, Stephen of Blois was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey. By the time Matilda found out, her cousin had already stolen the throne from her. This, in House of the Dragon, is the coronation of Aegon II. Rhaenyra is far away on Dragonstone giving birth. Aegon is crowned at King's Landing before she even gets the news. At Westminster, Stephen faced a simpler scenario than Aegon's. There were no dragons in play. But Stephen and Aegon had something in common. Neither one was capable of ruling. The chroniclers of the period are brutal with Stephen. They describe him as brave in battle, but an inept ruler. His own brother abandoned him mid-war. His lords switched sides with the seasons. And when Matilda invaded England in 1139, accompanied by her half-brother Robert of Gloucester, the historical equivalent of Daemon Targaryen, loyal to Matilda and politically unpredictable, with greater military skill than Stephen, the civil war we today call the Anarchy began. Stephen's inability to rule had consequences, and to compensate for the desertion of the English nobility, Stephen did what no legitimate king had ever done before. He imported an entire mercenary army, commanded by William of Ypres, a Flemish bastard, illegitimate grandson of Robert I, Count of Flanders, exiled by his own family. Stephen named him captain of his personal guard, gave him English lands, and left half his war in the hands of a man without a drop of noble blood in his veins. The English chroniclers hated him. But he stayed loyal to Stephen until the end. In House of the Dragon, Rhaenyra's desperate decision to accept bastards as dragon riders, the dragon seeds, has its historical shadow here. When a throne is shaking, who is legitimate stops mattering. Only who fights does. 15 years. 15 years of fire in the harvests, castles under siege, lords switching sides, women and children starving in villages left without a lord, without protection, without law. And across all those 15 years, 3 moments. 3 moments that sum up the entire war. First moment. February 1141. The armies of Empress Matilda and Stephen clashed in the city of Lincoln. Stephen, true to form, fought until the end. When there were no men left around him, when the nobles had already fled, and he was captured. For the first time in 6 years, Matilda came close to reigning. The lords knelt. They led her to Winchester. They proclaimed her, not queen, because England could not yet utter that word, but Lady of the English. A title invented to evade the word the kingdom would not tolerate. And Lady Matilda went to London to be crowned. And then another character named Matilda appears, Matilda of Boulogne, the second woman who inspired Alicent, heiress to the coastal county of Boulogne and, through her mother, first cousin to Lady Matilda. Stephen had married her 16 years before. And when Stephen fell at Lincoln in 1141, it was she who reorganized the army, forced the negotiation with London, and accomplished what Stephen could not do on his own. Like Alicent, Matilda of Boulogne was not a decorative queen. Without her, the war would have ended that same year, and Stephen would not have remained in power. Meanwhile, the other Matilda, Lady Matilda, demanded a special tax to fund her coronation, and the Londoners revolted. The city bells rang in reverse, the medieval signal of popular uprising, the call summoning the population to arms. An armed mob marched toward the palace where Matilda was dining. She barely had time to mount a horse and flee. She was never crowned. Second moment. A few months later, in September 1141, Robert of Gloucester, the loyal half-brother, Matilda's demon, was captured by Stephen's forces at the rout of Winchester, and Matilda did the only thing she could. She released Stephen, whom she had captured at Lincoln months before, in exchange for Robert. Stephen walked out of prison. Matilda got her brother back. The war went on. In House of the Dragon, there is no exact equivalent to this exchange, but the lesson is always present in the show. In a war of succession, no prisoner is just a prisoner. He is always a currency. And Matilda, in that instant of 1141, was forced to spend the only currency that could have bought her the throne. Third moment. December 1142, Oxford Castle. Matilda has been under siege by Stephen's troops for 3 months. Famine is already inside the walls. The soldiers have already eaten every horse. No help is coming. One night, no one knows exactly which one, the chroniclers disagree on the date. Matilda and 3 knights wrap themselves in white cloaks. They lower themselves by rope from the top of St. George's Tower. The river Thames is frozen. Matilda and her 3 knights walk 6 miles on foot across the frozen river in the dead of night, dressed in white to blend with the snow, crossing the lines of the enemy army where the guards keep 24-hour watch. They reach Wallingford alive. The anonymous chronicler of the Gesta Stephani wrote it like this: "In a wondrous fashion she escaped unhurt through so many enemies, so many watchers in the silence of the night, whom the king had carefully posted on every side of the castle." Another chronicler, William of Malmesbury, describes it more concisely: "A manifest miracle of God." And the Gesta Stephani added a line easy to overlook: "I had never read of another woman rescued so fortunately from so many mortal enemies." That was Matilda. And that is what most of those who watch House of the Dragon do not know, that the woman who inspired Rhaenyra Targaryen escaped one night on foot across a frozen river, dressed in white against the snow, while 2 miles behind her, the soldiers lit torches to hunt her down. The Anarchy is the backbone of House of the Dragon, but Martin leaves no gaps. When the English Civil War was not enough, Martin jumped to other moments in history in search of more blood. and he found it in documented medieval practices that gave life to 4 of the most terrifying scenes in the series. In the first episode of the series, Aemma Arryn dies in childbirth. Viserys must choose between his wife's life and his son's. The maesters extract the heir by cutting open the mother's body without anesthesia, holding her down against the bed. The scene is brutal, precisely because it is not fiction. It is the literal citation of a documented medieval obstetric practice. It was called the Lex Regia, the royal law. Originally Roman, inherited by the medieval church, it said that if the mother was dying or already dead in childbirth, it was the surgeon's duty to cut her open to extract the child alive and baptize it. The operation, what we today call a perimortem caesarean, was almost always fatal for the mother. That is why it was only performed when she was already lost. The most famous historical case occurs in 1537 at the court of Henry VIII of England. Jane Seymour, his third wife, gives birth to the future Edward VI after a labor that drags on for 3 days. The surgeons ask the king what to do if they have to choose between mother and heir. It is said Henry VIII chose to save the child. Jane dies of puerperal fever 12 days later. The line Aemma whispers to Rhaenyra before the birth, "The childbed is our battlefield," was not invented by Martin. It is the near-textual echo of medieval letters written by queens who understood what the crown demanded of them. Childbirth was a war, and war always had casualties. In episode 7 of the first season, on the beach of Driftmark, Rhaenyra's sons and Alicent's sons fight. Aemond loses an eye. The court convenes. Alicent, out of control, demands one of Lucerys's eyes, in a literal application of lex talionis, an eye for an eye. What the viewer does not know is that this demand was not personal vengeance. It was medieval politics by the book. In Byzantine, Frankish, and Anglo-Saxon cultures, blinding someone was the equivalent of killing his power without killing his body. The most famous case? Basil II, Byzantine emperor, in the year 1014. After the Battle of Clodion against the Bulgarian Empire, he captured 15,000 soldiers. He divided them into groups of 100. Of every 100, he completely blinded 99, both eyes burned out with iron. To the one remaining soldier in each group, he left a single eye to guide the rest back to their king. When Tsar Samuel saw the procession of his blind army entering his court, he collapsed. He died 2 days later. The Byzantine chronicler, John Skylitzes, records it as a death from shock. 4 years later, the Bulgarian Empire had ceased to exist. Basil went down in history as Bulgaroctonus, the Bulgar Slayer. There were 3 reasons to take the eyes and not the life. The first, dynastic disqualification. A king had to be whole to rule, and mutilation eliminated him without spilling royal blood. The second, symbolic mercy. Not killing was religiously defensible. The third, lasting public humiliation. A corpse is buried. A blind man walks the streets for years. When Alicent asks for Lucerys's eye, she is not asking for justice. She is asking for his disqualification as heir. A one-eyed Valerian could not sit on the Iron Throne without the entire court remembering the humiliation. Lucerys refuses, not out of ethics, but because he understands what she is asking for. In episode 10 of the first season, Lucerys is devoured by Vhagar, Aemon's dragon. But that death is no invention either. It has a date, the year 1203, England. King John I, yes, the one from the Robin Hood stories, captures his nephew Arthur of Brittany, 16 years old. Arthur is a claimant to the English throne through his mother's line, with better rights than his uncle. He is being held at the castle of Rouen. One night, he disappears. The most reliable chronicles agree King John murdered him with his own hands, possibly drunk, and threw the body into the River Seine. Uncle, nephew, claimant to the throne. Murder without witnesses. Civil war as the consequence. Finally, in the first episode of the second season, 2 assassins enter the Red Keep at night. find Queen Helena with her children, and force her to choose which of the children will die. The scene is probably the most disturbing in the entire series, and it is not fiction either. The most famous historical case that inspired this moment? The princes in the Tower. And it happened 3 centuries after the Anarchy, in 1483. Edward V, 12 years old, and his younger brother Richard of York, 9, are locked in the Tower of London by their uncle, Richard III, who displaced them from the line of succession and had himself crowned. The children are last seen in the summer of 1483. The 2 most widely accepted theories are that they were smothered with pillows or buried alive beneath the floor of the tower. What are believed to be their bodies were found almost 2 centuries later beneath a staircase during renovations to the tower. They rest today in Westminster Abbey, in a sarcophagus, with no certainty, even now, of who killed them. From here on, there may be spoilers for the 3rd season of House of the Dragon, because we are going to talk about how the real history that inspired the show ends. Matilda never sat on the throne of England. Robert of Gloucester died in 1147. Without him, Matilda lost her commander. In 1148, she crossed the Channel for the last time and returned to Normandy. England had won the war against her, but it had not yet won the peace. Matilda died in Rouen in 1167, after spending her final years in retirement at the Abbey of Notre-Dame-du-Pré. She was buried at the Abbey of Bec-et-Luan in Normandy. She never set foot again in the kingdom that had ignored the oaths sworn for her 3 times before the altar. In Matilda's place, her son fought. In 1153, at 19 years old, Henry, the son of Matilda and Geoffrey Plantagenet of Anjou, crossed into England at the head of an army. Stephen was aging. He had lost his own heir. His son Eustace died that same year, according to some chronicles, choking during a banquet on a dish of eels, a detail that Martin recycles almost verbatim in the death of a certain teenage king poisoned at a wedding. And Stephen signed the Treaty of Wallingford. He signed because he was out of options. He had lost his heir months before, his lords were tired of 15 years of war, and Henry had an army on English soil. The treaty allowed him to die as king, but his successor would not be his son. It would be Matilda's son. Stephen died a year later. In 1154, the son of the woman the kingdom had refused to accept as its sovereign was crowned Henry II Plantagenet, 400 years before England would accept its first queen in her own right, Mary I, in 1553. Henry's descendants ruled England for 300 years, the dynasty that produced Richard the Lionheart, the Magna Carta, the 100 Years' War. All of that England is Matilda's blood. And here is what Martin understood when he turned this history into the Dance of the Dragons. The Civil War did not end when the legitimate heir sat on the throne. It ended when it was a man who carried the crown. Matilda lost the crown, but her blood reached the throne anyway, through her son, and 20 years late. The Targaryen blood will continue on the Iron Throne, as Matilda's blood continued on the throne of England. But what Martin is telling is not the victory of a woman. It is the price the system charges when a woman claims what belongs to her. 15 years of fire, so that it would be the same family that ended up in power, but never a woman. But there is a question older than the anarchy, and the answer reveals what the medieval system was really protecting. Why did England reject Matilda? It was not because of her. It was because of the system. Linear patriarchal succession, the rule that says the throne passes to the eldest male son, is not natural law. It is engineering. And like all engineering, it enters crisis when a piece fails. When the male line fails, the system has no mechanism to repair itself without blood. And the blood, in these cases, always runs from the side of the one who tried to occupy the place the system had not assigned to them. France codified the exclusion of women from the throne. They called it Salic law. If there is no direct male heir, women cannot inherit nor transmit the kingdom, not even to their own son. The 100 Years' War began over exactly that logic. The King of England claimed the French throne because his mother was the sister of the last childless French king. France replied that on its soil, a woman could not transmit the right to the crown. What England lived through between 1138 and 1153, what Martin turned into the Dance of the Dragons, is not an isolated event. It is a pattern that repeated again and again across entire centuries of European history. Institutional misogyny is not ideology. It is a documented historical engine that for 7 centuries cost millions of lives in Europe. When Rhaenyra falls, she does not fall because she is weak. She falls because the system was designed so that she would fall. And that is what Martin knows, and what he shows in every scene of House of the Dragon where a lord betrays the oath he himself swore in favor of a woman. The Dance of the Dragons, the civil war between Rhaenyra and Aegon II, is not pure fiction. It is events out of bloody English history with dragons on top. And George R.R. Martin's world is more than fire and dragons. It is a mirror of reality. The mirror of a ship that sank on a moonless night in the English Channel, of a woman dressed in white crossing a frozen river in the middle of the night, of violent miscarriages, infanticides, and eyes torn out. But above all, of a system that allowed one family to rule as long as it was a man who carried the crown. English history is the proof that even when a fantasy tale seems too dark to be real, the true history behind it can be far more terrifying. This is the Grimm Vault, the next tale, the story behind Pinocchio and the Italian children who were already beasts of burden decades before Collodi ever wrote about Pleasure Island.